Okay, hi guys.
Well,
What's up? Okay, so we're here today because of all the things that are happening in the world right now, um, especially targeted towards the Shia community in Pakistan. And my friends and I here decided to have a conversation about all the things we never got to ask each other growing up. So I'll go first. My name's Ieasha, and I was raised Sunni. My entire family is Sunni. And I didn't have any Shia friends growing up. And my first Shia friend was actually in college. Yeah, that's him. All right, Zen, you go second.
hey guys, my name's Zen. I guess I was born and raised Shia. My whole lineage is Shia. It goes back to Prophet Muhammad. And my first real interactions with people from the Sunni sect was actually in college as well. I had learned about kind of Sunni Islam and their teachings and what they believe, like just through kind of going to lectures and stuff like that. But actually interacting with people who are Sunni was at college. It was really a great learning experience for me. And they're my brothers and sisters in faith. So I'm happy that Ieasha reached out with all the Shia genocide going on in Pakistan. I mean, it's been going on, but at this point in time, it's elevated and the Shia hate is real. So I really appreciate her reaching out to us and kind of putting this together.
This is such a serious conversation. I don't want to smile, but I'm so okay. Liba, you
I,
go next.
I think we're going to be laughing throughout the whole thing.
I was trying to stop my smile, but I can't.
I'm a natural smiler.
Okay, I guess I'll go. My name is Liba. I grew up Sunni and I became Shia freshman year of high school, so that's like 7-ish years ago. I didn't really grow up with much Shia influence, so it first started like through reading books and everything, and then actually becoming a part of the Shia community like very recently, like at the end of high school and in college now. So yeah, that's my experience.
Yeah, for context, Liba has the most interesting story. If you grew up Muslim, you don't hear a lot of people switching sects or having their families accept them. But Liba brings a really unique perspective today. I'll kick us off. So, when was the first time you heard the terms Shia and Sunni?
So I guess I could take this. I mean, growing up in a Shia household and in a Shia community, very close-knit community, obviously, like we were very exposed to Shia belief through Muharram, through Ramzan, going to the mosque, going to the center all the time. We would pretty much only hear like stories about the Prophet and his family. Like there was never really any discussion like, oh, this is what Sunnis are and this is what Shias are. It was just mainly like just building love of the Prophet and his family throughout my life, to be quite honest. The main time I learned what Sunni Islam is when like some speakers would come and they'd talk about kind of what Sunni beliefs are. I think some of the more influential times when speakers came and they held Q&A sessions or just informational sessions to teach us like what is in Sunni books, like what do they believe, like who are there, who's Imam Malik, who's Imam Shafi, things of that nature. It was never done so in a derogatory sense, I would say. It was more so done on an educational sense. And so when I was exposed to, more Sunnis in college, I kind of knew their beliefs in a sense, but it made me realize that I probably don't know my beliefs as well as I should have. So I think that was a great opportunity for me to kind of learn about both even more in detail, which I guess allows me to talk a little bit about what we're going to be talking about today, which I'm excited about. But yeah.
Okay. What about you, Liba?
Yeah, I've never heard the words like Shia Sunni until I was in high school and like doing research for like a history project. And I was very confused. And I think it was like mentioned in Sunday schools. Like kids would ask like, oh, I have a Shia friend. What does that mean? But our like Sunday school teachers would just mainly say, don't worry about it. It was like kind of like waved off and never really like nothing bad was said, but there was like this air that was built up of it's something that's bad. There was like something that was not allowed.
Right.
But I also never even heard the word Sunni before, which was interesting to try to like learn about what that meant as well. So like those words are kind of off limit for me when I was growing up.
I feel really similarly. So I grew up in Bangladesh, which is a Sunni majority country. That being said, we never really hear the term Sunnis or Shias being passed around, right? Because you just grow up in that circle and everyone follows the same sect, so it's not something we're very vocal about. Like you, I also found out about the different sects in high school, and it was similar. It wasn't taboo. It was just like not people didn't want to address it. I asked my dad, and he was just like, "Yeah, they're just a different sect of Islam." And quite honestly, I'm not sure if he knows the differences either. It's just like the unknown, and we never had line of sight into the other sect, and we just never asked. Which is why I think today's conversation is so important.
Yeah, I think it's like interesting because at least from my experience, like whenever I talk to other people, like obviously some know what Shias are, like maybe they've grown up with them, they have friends that are Shia, whereas others, like you mentioned, like if they come up, people are like, oh no, don't worry about them. Like some misconceptions I've heard or some things I've heard is like if someone talks to their local scholar about Shias, they're like, oh, don't talk to them. They'll brainwash you, this and that. And whereas like for me, it's always been like if we discuss like what Sunni beliefs are, who Sunnis are, our scholars are always open to talking about it from like Sunni books, in fact, and through the Quran itself. And so like I've never really understood why there's not as much discussion around it as there should be. Like there's some like very beautiful, like for example, I think it's called Al-Munajat or something like that. It's this like series of letters between a Sunni scholar and a Shia scholar, and they talk in such a beautiful way with each other and with such respect. And so it's possible. I think it's the lack of knowledge between both of our sects that causes us to be more rejective and just stubborn and arrogant when talking about these sects, whereas like in Al-Munajat, both these scholars are so respectful with each other because they are knowledgeable.
So, what have you heard about Sunni Muslims from your Shia scholars growing up?
Yeah, I mean it's just like more so just understanding your beliefs, right? So like your fiqh comes from 4 different imams.
Define what fiqh is.
It's like it's like laws, right? Like just like how you live and like what you're allowed to eat, what's halal, what's haram for you essentially. And then like also the beliefs of mainly like what happened after the prophet's death, who the caliphs are, who you believe the caliphs are, what you believe about the prophet, for example, and things of that nature, and just understanding your perspective on history, really. I think it's important to understand that history is history and we both have different perspectives on it, which is fine, right? And we just have to respect each other's views on it. And at times it can get sensitive just because the history is sensitive. But that doesn't mean we disrespect each other, right? Like, and agree to disagree on topics, which is fine. But we should never stoop to lows and disrespect each other. So like, really it's just like learning about what Sunnis believe, like after the prophet, the 4 Khalifas, and then like stuff of that nature, really. And then just like how we view the prophet differently in a sense, because we view the prophet as being infallible, someone who has been purified, and his family as well. Whereas, at least from what I've learned, is like Sunnis don't believe that majority. And so just like those differences and why they exist, it's never really been like, oh, Sunnis are so terrible, don't ever talk to them. It's just more of learning about what you guys believe, and then learning about what we believe and why there's difference. And at the end of the day, it's up to us to decide what we think is right or wrong, right? So
Yeah. And that's a good point. And I guess for anyone who's watching this or eventually watching this, it's interesting because we're definitely not a group of scholars. And
Yeah.
when you say things like, oh, this is what I learned about Sunnis growing up, I don't even know, because we never talked about the differences between the sects. I don't even know what Sunnis are supposed to believe in versus what textbooks say. So it's really interesting to me, like when you mention, like, yeah, we believe that the prophet is infallible and the family is too, and Sunnis don't believe the same. I guess the closest thing I've heard is there's no one like the prophet. He's raised at the highest, he's at the highest bar, and everyone else are just a human. I mean, we obviously think the prophet is a human as well. I think that's also a big thing that we need to address. A lot of people forget that the prophet was human and he was still able to do all the good that he was, but I think that's a different conversation. But it's interesting that you bring your knowledge to the table from what you've heard from Shia scholars, where I've never heard Sunni scholars bring these differences up. I want to say, when have you heard about the Battle of Karbala? But I want to ease the playing field and say, have you ever heard about the Battle of Karbala growing up?
Yeah, I mean, like for us, the Battle of Karbala is like essential, right? I mean, historically, it happened 50 years after the Prophet's death to the Prophet's grandson, for whom he has said in both of our books. I mean, we both believe he said, like, Hussein is from me, I am from Hussein. We know that, you know, whenever he would pray and Imam Hussein would sit on his back, he wouldn't get up from prayer until he got off of his back. So that respect that he had. And then there's multiple different hadiths and sayings of the Prophet in respect of Imam Hussein. For example, he's the master of youth in paradise, right? And so for us, the time of Muharram, the month of Muharram and Safar are meant to mourn the tragedy of Karbala, because we feel like if we get closer to those that were really close to God and sacrifice everything for his sake, we will then ourselves get closer to God through them and through learning their lessons and through learning what they taught us. And truly, I can't tell you how much I've learned from remembering Karbala every single year. And every year you learn something more. And like, I would not be the person I am today without being brought up in that way. Whereas I think, I mean, I don't want to speak for you, but like some Sunnis know about Karbala, some Sunnis have absolutely no idea what it is, which I don't understand why maybe it's hidden. I don't know. Maybe it's just not taught. I don't know. I mean, but for us specifically, it's literally vital to our faith, essentially, I would say.
Yeah, so Liba and I were talking about the fact that in our Sunni households growing up, we've never learned about the Battle of Karbala. And I also want to preface by saying I don't come from the most religious household, so maybe there are Sunni households where it is talked about, just not in my case. But Liba, I'm curious, because you have such a unique journey, and having seen both the Shia and the Sunni perspectives, how did you react when you first learned about the Battle of Karbala, and how did your family respond to you when you started talking about Muharram?
I think it was really interesting, like Zan mentioned, like the hadiths about Imam Hussein with the Prophet. And those are like hadiths that I grew up with, like listening to. My mom would, like, she loved those stories and she would always tell them to us. And so I knew who Imam Hussein was, but I didn't know, it kind of stopped at his childhood. So I've always imagined Imam Hussein as a child. I never thought of him as getting older in a way, which, you know, now when I think about it, I'm like, okay, of course he got older. But just in the way that it was presented to me, it was sort of like he was born, the Prophet loved him, he was a great youth, he was announced as the master of the youth in paradise, but then it kind of ends there. And so when I heard about the Battle of Karbala, I remember just being like, I don't know what this is. And I remember listening to the Masayib, which is when the Sheikh speaks about the tragedies that happened on the day of Ashura and Karbala. And I remember just feeling so amazed at how I didn't know any of this. And there's like such spiritual importance. I believe that there's such spiritual importance in the sacrifice that he made and that his companions made. And I remember just feeling so confused at that point of trying to reconcile why this wasn't told to me and why it was sort of hidden. And I remember bringing it up to my parents, my family, and trying to understand what it was. And my family had known about it, but it wasn't, they kind of didn't know the full story. It was, I remember when I was talking to my dad, he would say, well, I know he was killed, but he didn't know who did it or why.
Yeah, like who's Yazid? Like literally that name, who is that? I feel like I had to do my own research to find out about the history.
Yeah, I remember just like Googling so many things and like trying to figure out like what, like how did this happen? What led to this? Like when did this happen? And trying to like make my own timeline, trying to understand. I guess most of what I was taught about Islam kind of ends right before the Prophet dies. And so I guess that's kind of why I didn't get that exposure to the battle.
Yeah, and I think you hit it on the head in the fact that like the Battle of Karbala is entirely spiritual, right? To see a man stand up to save, and he himself said like, the only reason I'm standing up is to save the teachings of my father. I mean, my grandfather, the Prophet, and my father, Imam Ali, like to save the Ummah because he saw it was deviating from what the Prophet came with, right? And then like I think like at least from my perspective, from like a Shia perspective, if I think about okay, why is it not talked about in like a Sunni household? The only reason I can think of is like it is a sensitive topic in terms of like the historical context of like how Yazid came to power, essentially, right? But I never think that like if something's sensitive, we don't discuss. Essentially, at least that's how I've been raised. Like you can always be respectful in sensitivity, right? As long as you stick to facts and you don't kind of let your emotions overtake facts at the end of the day. That's how I view it. I mean, I'm not too sure.
Can you give us more details around, you touched on it, you said how Yazid rose to power. Can you give us more context around that?
Yeah, I mean, so essentially, historically speaking, like after the Prophet's death, obviously that's where like Shia Sunni differ mostly of like, so obviously that's sensitive, so that doesn't get discussed too often. But like in Shia communities, it gets discussed like on a factual basis, like what happened and what we believe is right, right? But in terms of like the political atmosphere of the time, like Abu Bakr became caliph, and then Umar became caliph, Usman became caliph, and then Imam Ali became caliph, like politically speaking. And then after Imam Ali is when things get hairy with Muawiyah, because then Muawiyah got the caliphate. And in order to protect the Muslim Ummah and to keep peace, Imam Ali's son, Imam Hassan, signed a peace treaty with him to prevent any bloodshed, right? And part of that was like after Muawiyah passes away, or after Muawiyah's caliphate, the caliphate would go to the family of the Prophet, essentially. If I'm wrong, by the way, historically, please correct me. I don't know, but this is kind of what I know. And he kind of rejected what was in the peace treaty, and he made his son Yazid caliph of the Muslim Ummah. And it's very clear from historical context that Yazid was blatantly not practicing Muslim beliefs. Like he was an alcoholic, very clearly. At the end of the day, I mean, he killed the Prophet of the grandson, right?
Right.
So because of like what led to him being a leader, so you would have to track back to Muawiyah, and then you have to track back, like it becomes sensitive. And so I believe that's why people don't talk about it. And like I've seen, like for example, there's this clip on YouTube of like a Sunni scholar who's like very upset, like why wasn't I taught this? You didn't teach me this because you thought I would become Shia. No, like this is stuff we should learn because it's spiritually uplifting for Shia, Sunni, for anyone. Like Imam Hussein's stance is for everyone. like for example, when I went on the Arba'een walk in Karbala, which is like when 20, 30 million people go to Iraq to kind of commemorate the 40th day after he passed, after he was massacred. People from every religion are there, like Shia, Sunni, like Jews, Christians, Hindus. So like it's for everyone. So I've never understood why it's definitely not just a Shia lesson that we can take. It's for everyone. Yeah. At the end of the day.
I guess you kind of touched on the next question, but to bring us back to what we were talking about before this call was, okay, so do the Sunni even believe or follow Yazid? Like, do we think he was right? I remember last month, someone, Laiba, you probably remember this too, but Laiba and I are part of this fellowship, and another Muslim person asked, like, oh, is the Battle of Karbala essentially when the Shia and the Sunni fought and there was a war? And obviously, like, all of that, the details are so lost in modern day practice. Like, we don't even know who Yazid is. Like, does he represent the Sunni sect? I want to say no, because at the end of the day, this is the family of the Prophet we're talking about. I think people become so blind in the discrimination and the biases that we have against Shia that we forget that at the end of the day, this is the family of the Prophet, and we need to continue to respect that. But again, not a scholar. I probably should do more research before talking on this, but want to hear your perspectives.
I totally agree with you, Ieasha. Growing up, there wasn't this emphasis of like, oh, Yazid was right and everything. It was like the opposite of, oh, Imam Hussein was this great man and clearly he had spiritual knowledge. Yeah, and I remember like having conversations with my grandma about asking her, what do you know about the Battle of Karbala? Because I remember her telling me, like, I had the TV on and it was the month of Muharram, and she told me to turn it off because there was like a song playing. And I remember asking her, like, oh, like, so what do you know about like Muharram and the Battle of Karbala? And she's like, Imam Hussein was killed by Yazid. Yazid was a bad man. But she also didn't know that Yazid was the son of Muawiyah. So she was kind of a bit like lost on like the political history of it, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing. For her, it was she knew that Imam Hussein was in the right, and she felt more attached to that, and that's what she chose to focus on.
Yeah, and like with all the anti-Shia stuff going on right now in Pakistan, like I remember seeing a clip like a couple of days ago of people like praising Yazid, and a lot of Sunni scholars came out denouncing that. Because I mean, if you look historically, it's very clear that that Yazid was probably not even, I mean, he was not a practicing Muslim, right? Like he was an alcoholic. He killed he killed the grandson of the Prophet. And he took his family in chains and removed the hijabs of the women. And he clearly said, like, if my ancestors from the Battle of Badr were there, like, to see the vengeance I took on the Prophet and his family, like those statements clearly show that he's not Muslim, right? Like, and so like I never view the Battle of Karbala, like this has never even come up in our communities that it was Shia versus Sunni. Like literally, I've never heard that before in my life. Because like Sunni belief comes after like the four imams, right? Who came and created the different laws that you all follow, whether it's Imam Malik, Imam Shafi. Whereas like there was really no Shia Sunni back then, right? I feel like that all happened later on. Like at least in terms of Shia belief, like we believe in the Prophet and his family in terms of lineage and who's the rightful successor of the Prophet's message and like protector of that message. So for us, it's always starts with the Prophet himself and then continues from there. But yet the battle, I don't think Yazid was Sunni. I don't think he was Shia. Like he was just his own little mess, I think, at the end of the day, in my humble opinion. Sorry if I offend anyone, but
I think we're all going to offend people. If
Yeah,
that's
I don't.
this is
I
this
don't
is
really.
a
I don't really mind if people get offended by that.
this is yeah, okay. I guess you answered our question. It was we wanted to know what do the Shia actually believe in, and you answered that quite simply. It's the Prophet and his family.
Yeah, no,
And
like so when people ask me this and I tell them, they're like, really? Like that's what you believe? Because like all Shias believe in is the Sunnah of the Prophet, right? Now where Shia Sunnis differ is what that Sunnah is, right? We believe, I mean, like obviously we both have our proofs for what we believe, and it's through Quran and Hadith, right? Hadith is pretty much the sayings of the Prophet and his family and companions, whatever. Um, but we believe that the Prophet came with a message that completed God's message, right? And God wouldn't leave his message unattended. So the Sunnah of the Prophet wouldn't be left unattended for people to interpret in their own interpretation, right? So to keep that pure and like safe and in its original form, we believe that the imams, the 12 imams after the Prophet, which there's a hadith that the Prophet says like there will be 12 leaders from the Quraysh after me, and that's in both of our books as well. So that's what we believe in, like the 12 divinely appointed guides. So we don't believe anything new was ever added to the Sunnah of the Prophet. Like that's a complete. We'll get into misconceptions later, but like the imams didn't bring anything new, right? And like you said, like the Prophet's up here. He's the best of God's creation. And we'll also hit on that a little later as well. But yeah, simply put, Shias believe in the Quran, they believe in the Prophet's Sunnah, and what the Prophet told us to do. And the imams that come after the Prophet are there to help us interpret and understand the Quran and the Prophet's message the way God wanted it to be understood, not the way we want to understand it, right? Because we don't have that knowledge to really understand what God wants us to understand. Like that's why he sent the Prophet, right? And so that's why we believe in the imams that come after him to guide us to stay true to what the Prophet brought. And that's what Imam Hussein essentially saved, right? So.
Liba, do you have anything to add to that?
Not really. It's just, yeah, he hit the nail on the head. And it's kind of similar to kind of how Sunni, like the 4 different schools of thought developed as well. Because in like the Sunni world, there was this need of, okay, now we need to interpret these new issues that are coming up, these new like legal issues, social issues. How do we figure this out? And each school had a different answer. Some was with like reasoning, others was just like with just the straight up facts. And so with Shia Islam, we had the imams, and so that was our way of interpreting new rulings and new social issues that came up. So I usually like to use that to explain it because it's like, you know, the differences between the Shia and the Sunni, those same differences exist between the Sunnis as well.
Yeah, and I think there's some form of that still existent today. Like we're still trying to figure out, especially Gen Z and modern day America, like what are we supposed to believe? Can we do this? Can we do that? Is Nutella haram? It's not, but but like we're still trying to figure out the basics, I feel like, and that's going to continue to change and evolve. Well, I always wanted to sit people down and just ask them really awkward questions, and
bring it on.
I am so excited to do this right now. Okay, so I heard a lot of misconceptions about the Shia belief growing up, and we discussed this, and I asked Zen and Liba whether they heard misconceptions about Sunni. Well, it doesn't apply to Liba, she grew up Sunni. And Zen was basically like, nah, man, I grew up with a scholar and I knew the facts, so it doesn't apply to Zen. But
no, like, not in that sense, but like we were never taught misconceptions, essentially. Like compared to the misconceptions I've heard about Shias, like if I compare and contrast, we never learned anything or heard anything of that sort against Sunnis.
Yeah. No, it was a joke. It's okay. You don't have to be that defensive.
I'm a nice kid, okay?
But okay, so my first misconception that I grew up with are that Shias worship shrines. And I want to clarify what I mean by shrines. Growing up, I was under the impression that shrines meant physical, sculpted, like statues of human beings, like the prophets' families, and that's where Shias went to pay their respects. And obviously, in Islam, I mean, I'm sure Shias, Sunnis, everyone will agree to this. We do not worship idols. That's just one thing we don't do. So naturally, in my head, 11-year-old Ieasha was like, oh, so they're not Muslim. How do you feel about that? And what are these shrines?
Yeah, so like shrines essentially are just monuments, you could say, that are built over personalities that are revered in Islam, right? And even like the Quran itself says like those who die on the path of God are never dead, but you don't like understand, right? So like, and then like, it's just a form of respect, honestly, for these individuals. So like Prophet Muhammad has a shrine over his grave, right? And we go there to pay respects. Imam Hussein has a shrine over his grave, and we go there to pay respects. And there's a mutual belief in Shia-Sunni literature, I guess, of like an intermediary between us and God, right? So we attach ourselves to those who are really close to God, that we know are close to God, and ask God through their, I guess, intermediary. It's not that we're asking them, we're asking God through them. And so I think what the biggest misconception is when people see us go to these shrines and pay respect, they think that we're worshiping the shrine itself, which is shirk. Like literally, like if I saw someone in Karbala praying towards Imam Hussein's shrine, that's shirk at the end of the day. Like they were disbelieving.
Okay, define shirk.
Shirk is like, well, I think it means like when you believe in someone other than God as God.
It's essentially blasphemy.
Yeah, essentially blasphemy. So like that's completely not allowed. So like the idea of building these monuments around or mosques around these graves, it's like supported, for example, in the Quran. If you look at Surah Kahf, like there's two groups that come to the people of the cave, and the group that kind of wins is the one that builds a mosque over them, right? And so like God never denounced them building a mosque over them in the Quran itself, right? If it was wrong, it would have clearly denounced them for doing so. And like the Qibla, or like the direction in which we pray, for example, in Karbala and Najaf, it's never towards the shrine. It's always towards the Kaaba itself. So, I mean, if people think we're praying towards, like actually praying at the grave and like thinking that they're God and that they're going to fulfill our wishes, that's completely inaccurate. Like it's through them that God's going to listen to us, because of how close they are to him, right? Like, for example, the prophet is the closest being to God. So like, why not ask God through him, right? We believe God will look at us with a much more lenient and merciful lens if we do that and attach ourselves to those that are close to him. And so, yeah, we don't pray to shrines. It's just a form of respect and to show our love towards these individuals. And like, I don't think any Sunni, honestly, like Sunnis don't disagree either. It's mainly the Wahhabi sect that kind of points towards, oh, this is bid'ah, but like they're just in their own world with their beliefs, to be honest. Whereas like Sunnis and Shias kind of agree on this.
Yeah, Imam Shafi, who like led the Shafi school of thought, there are like so many writings of his where he tells like his students to, what if they ever want their prayers to be answered, like very quickly, to go to the shrine of Imam Musa al-Kazim, who's one of the 12 Imams. And so that's what the Shafi school of thought is built after, and he was totally okay with like shrines and praying at shrines. And a good way that I've had, because when I first learned about like intercession and like praying, like having the names of the Imams like in your prayers, I thought I was one of the people who thought it was like shirk. Mm-hmm. But a scholar had explained it as your prayer is a letter to God, and the Imams, when you take their names, it's as if they're putting their stamp on your letter. So it's not necessarily going to them, it's still going to the same person, but they just have their stamp of approval on it, which that was like, to me, I was like, whoa, that makes sense.
I think I really like the way that you phrase that. It's having a stamp of approval on it. And while I've never seen that practice actually live through my family, we will pray directly to God. I've never also heard that it's shirk to associate your du'as, your prayers, through someone. It's just like to Zen's point, so God looks at you with a kinder lens. So I'm learning something new every day.
If I like made a prayer and like, God, I'm asking you through my brother, like that's gonna get rejected real quick. But like, for example,
Wow, way to like blast your brother. But
if I'm asking through like someone who literally gave everything they had for the sake of spreading God's religion, like I'm pretty sure he's gonna look at me with a more lenient lens and accept my prayer. Hopefully, fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. Inshallah. Okay, we have 2 more minutes left on this Zoom. I sent you guys another link. Hopefully
we're gonna shift over to another Zoom right now
because we're broke.
Yeah, we're broke. You know, the Zoom meeting membership's a little pricey. You know.
Right. I'll move on to the next question. Okay, so in college, again, because Zen is my first Shia friend, I've seen him pray with a stone, and I always wondered what that stone was. And I never asked him, but then eventually I found out what it was. But now I'll ask him again. So Zen, what is the stone that Shia's prayed with?
Yeah, so like Shia belief based on like.
Okay, wait, can we just take a second? Like, I am literally making a fool out of myself, and Zen's like, yeah, but like.
Yeah, I mean, it's normal. Like, you're not Shia. Like, why would you know?
Okay, well, just like smile a little.
Oh, sorry, I was looking at something on my phone. Okay. So stones, we just like the way it feels on our forehead. Yeah. No, so just based on like our understanding of what the prophet used to do, right? Like we have hadiths and stuff like that that say that he used to pray on the ground, like natural earth.
Yeah.
And because like, I mean, we're in homes and stuff, it's not like we're just gonna go outside to pray. So the stone essentially is like that earth that's outside. We just bring it inside and pray on it. Versus praying on something that like clothes can be made out of, something that I don't really know the exact like law of reasoning behind it, but I do know that the prophet used to pray on the earth itself. And so that's essentially like, that's it. Like if I was outside praying, right, like in the grass, I wouldn't use a turba or the sajda that we have, because the ground is the ground, right? And when it comes to understanding why we do it, essentially, like from a more spiritual perspective, like there's this hadith where I believe it was Imam Ali that was asked the question, like the purpose of like the steps in prayer, right? And like, for example, when he says like when you first go down into sajda, right? That's a sign that God, I was created from this earth. That's a reminder that you were created from this earth. When you get up, it's a sign that he brought you to life and he brought you into this earth to live. When you go back down on that ground, on that earth, it's a reminder that I will die and I will be buried in this earth again.
Like you'd return to
I'll return to the earth. And then when you rise, it's like I'll then be resurrected from the earth on the day of judgment to face my judgment, right? So that's like the spiritual reasoning behind why we pray on earth. It's a reminder, like everything's a reminder, at least spiritually, religiously, that we do should remind us of our purpose on earth and who God is. So for us, that's like a daily 5 times a day reminder, like I was made from this earth. This is the earth that I'm going to return to, essentially. And so that's like, those are the main reasons. Like some people think we pray to the earth, which is completely not the case. Like, why would I pray to earth? It's not going to help me in any way. It's just the earth is what I was made out of, and it's what I'm going to return to. And that reminder is why I guess the prophet used to pray on earth and why we continue to pray on earth today.
That's really interesting, because a fun, quirky thing about one of my aunts, that I saw growing up was that she was paralyzed from the waist down, so she couldn't make wudu, which is kind of like a ritual washing of your body before you pray. Um, and instead, she had a little, it was like a little thing of clay that she would just touch and like
Yeah.
make her wudu. And I would always ask her, like, how do you think this like mimicking of wudu, touching this clay would validate what you do with water? Because with water, you're actually washing your body.
Yeah.
But she always told me like this was the second best thing. And in Islam, you are allowed to do that when you don't have water. So
Exactly.
that's really interesting because we never draw parallels between that and between a turba.
Yeah.
And I think there's a connection there from my unscholarly opinion.
That's actually really good. I've never thought about it from that lens either. Because like, for example, when you don't have water, like that's what you do. You touch the ground to purify yourself. So the earth is what, I mean, it has certain properties that God has given it, I guess. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a second option for us. But yeah, it's a good perspective.
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay. Misconception number infinity. Do you feel like you're closer to the Prophet's family being a Shia versus the Prophet himself?
Yeah, this is actually a really good question, and I don't want to. I like to get your thoughts on it too, um, but at least from my perspective, when I saw the question and when I was thinking about it, like no, I guess in a sense, because like it's hard to say like a complete no, because like we understand the love, like prophet is the prophet, you know, like there's no one, like there's no Prophet Muhammad other than Prophet Muhammad, right? um and we love his family because he told us to, like in the Quran he says, I ask of you nothing but to love my family, right? And like he's repeated multiple times the status of his family, right? Like whoever hurts them hurts me, whoever loves them loves me, things of that nature. And so because he's told us to respect and love his family, that's why we love his family the way that we do. But that in no way means that we don't love the prophet the same amount, or if that even more, right? I pulled up something that I wanted to kind of share. And like, because a lot of people think we believe and love Imam Ali more than we love the prophet. But for us, the way that we see it is like the prophet finished the message of God, right? Like he literally finished it, and all the trials and tribulations he went through to deliver that message to us cannot be compared, right? But then if we look at Imam Ali, he was with him every step of the way, protecting him and protecting the message, right? So if he had not been there to protect the prophet, for example, the Battle of Uhud and different scenarios like that, and then protecting the message after his death, like we wouldn't have the message that he delivered the way that he delivered, right? So like for us, it's like they're both extremely important figures for us, right? But if we look at, like, for example, Imam Ali and what he says about the prophet and how he speaks of the prophet and the respect that he gives the prophet, I think it'll show like what the Shias believe in terms of this. Like he says, Allah deputed the prophet with light and accorded him the highest precedence in selection. Through him, Allah united those who were divided, overpowered the powerful, overcame difficulties, and leveled rugged ground, thus removing misguidance right and left. So like there's so many different like quotes from the Imams that praise the Prophet's purity and everything that he did for Islam. And we believe in the Imams. And if the Imams believe that, then that's what we believe, because that's the truth, right? And so like, and I think the misconception, honestly, like if I were to think about it on a deeper level, of when people see our love for like Imam Hussein or Imam Ali, right? They say, "Wow, look how much they love Imam Ali," like, and they don't love the Prophet, right? I think it's because like our love for the Imams and his family is so high, right? And it might be higher than how people love, other people might love the Prophet. So they automatically assume that our love for the Imams and his family is more than the Prophet, because our love for the Imams is more than their love for the Prophet, right? But like if our love for the family is that high, just imagine how much we love the Prophet. And then if that's the level of how much we love the Prophet, imagine how much we love God. So that's how I think about it. All of it at the end of the day is to increase our love and knowledge of who God is. And it starts with loving his family as he asked us to do. And then in turn, loving the Prophet after understanding his family. And then after loving the Prophet, understanding his message, understanding God the way he's meant to be known. So that's my quick little blurb about how I think about it. But yeah, I don't think any Shia can say that they don't love the Prophet and hold him to such a high regard. Like he's the best of creation, period. Like I think that's the Shia belief. Yeah, I've never heard anything different.
That's like a mic drop. Like I don't know what to ask you after that. But Laiba, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I always think when I've read this, I thought about there's this hadith where the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ says, "I am the city of knowledge and Ali is its gate." And I hope I didn't butcher that, but it's along those lines.
No, yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Okay, good. Got a little nervous there. But yeah, it's kind of like we're not making Imam Ali to be the Prophet. I remember one of my family members had asked, or they had rather said that, oh, well, I heard in my school that, oh, the Shias believed that the angel Gabriel made a mistake and accidentally gave the Quran to the Prophet Muhammad. And it was just something like, whoa.
Yeah, I heard this one too. Yeah.
Wait, I've actually never heard that. Okay.
Very common in Pakistan.
Why we like cry and beat ourselves and things of that nature is because the angel of God made a mistake, God forbid, that he gave the message to Prophet instead of Imam Ali. It can't be further.
Oh wow. Yeah. Interesting.
I don't know, people just make up random things to make up for their lack of love for the Prophet, I guess, at the end of the day.
No, honestly, and it's just it comes from such a random place. And I remember when I first heard it, like even now when I think about it, I'm like, where did this, how does this happen? But it
really is a lack of knowledge. I feel like we're so afraid of the unknown that we will never venture out and ask just because we're like, we don't know, so it must be wrong.
And like when it comes to these misconceptions, like Laiba was saying, like it makes me laugh. I'm like, these people really thought about this. Like they sat down and were like, so maybe it's because they think that the Prophet wasn't supposed to get the message, but he accidentally got it from the angel, like
I feel like I shouldn't be laughing.
Sitting there on the side waiting for the message to come to him, and like he saw it go somewhere else. Like that's not the case at all. Like that's like blasphemy. Like, and I think Leva brought up a great point, because when I was talking, like I was thinking about saying that quote as well, because it really encapsulates everything that I was saying. Like the Prophet himself says, I'm the city of knowledge and Ali is its gate. And what other way do you enter a city but its gate, right? So if you don't respect the gate and you don't know how to approach the gate and you don't know how to open the gate, understand the gate, how do you ever expect to understand the city of knowledge that the Prophet held, And I think sometimes we downplay the role of the Prophet and the knowledge of the Prophet and his purpose. Like it's something that we can't even fathom who he really was, right? At the end of the day. And because of our inability to understand him, we kind of lower his status. But he's literally God's city of knowledge. Like imagine what that means,
Wow. Okay. I'm just going to move on to the next question, because I think those are really good points, and I would find it really interesting if anyone had counter arguments to that, because those are literally Prophet's words. You mentioned Matam, and I feel like, okay, first start with what that means. What is Matam? And then talk a little bit more about how that practice came to be prevalent in your lives. Like both of you have different backgrounds, so curious to hear that.
Yeah, I mean, Laiba, do you want to go first, or I don't know?
Yeah, sure, I can go first. I remember Matam was like kind of, I always saw it on like TV and online.
Tell us
and
what it is.
So Matam is like the ritual beating of the chest that is usually done to poetry during times of when Shias are commemorating martyrdoms. I hope that was a good definition. But
Yeah, like
uh,
the way I explain it too is like it's a natural form of mourning, right? Like for example, when you see a mother lose her young son, whatever, you might see her beating her chest, hitting her face. You know, for example, in the Quran itself, like in Surah Al-Dhariyat, like when I believe it was Prophet Ibrahim's wife who was told um, that she was gonna have a son, like she, like it says in the Quran that she smacked her face because she was like, I'm so old, like how am I gonna bear a child? And the Quran never denounced that because it's a natural form of mourning, right? Like slapping one's face. And so it's just like natural form of mourning. Like matam is like beating in the chest like this. Some people beat their thighs. Some people, like in the Quran says, like hit their face. And like when you hear the tragedy of Karbala, it just overtakes you. It's just so immense emotions that you feel of sorrow that like the only natural thing to do is like people will beat their chest. And so the way I explain it is like it's just like we've taken that natural form of mourning and kind of organized it where someone relays the story of what happened in Karbala and the tragedies that happened, and people kind of beat to it in a rhythmic way, essentially.
Yeah.
But sorry, continue, Lila.
no, you're good. Yeah, so I didn't know what it was until I started like Googling Shia and everything, and like videos and stuff would come up, and I just remember being kind of intimidated by it because it was so, I never saw anything like it, and it seemed very intense. And so even when I formally like said, okay, I am Shia, I believe in Shia thought, I remember like telling myself, well, I'm not going to be one of those Shias who like beats their chest and stuff. Like that's not going to be me. And actually, like last year, my friends they took me to my first ever majalises, and those are the gatherings held in honor of Imam Hussein in Muharram, and even for the other imams and their martyrdoms. And I remember my first one, I ended up doing Matam at the end. And it felt right because I finally felt like I was a part of the community. And there's like times I went to this one masjid where it was only Arabic speakers. And so when they were reciting poetry at the end, I didn't really know what they were saying, but doing Matam helped me feel like I was a part of it.
Yeah,
So yeah,
and
that's
like
just my personal.
like for me, it's like when you hear the tragedy, because it's very intense, you know, like you feel something in your heart that like nothing else can really make me feel. And like so then I really understand like it's a natural form of mourning because like you just want to like beat your chest, not like be like like, but you know just like hit your chest in mourning. And like I said, it's just a more organized manner of kind of doing that. And then when it comes to like the more extreme forms that people do, that many people see online and are like, well, Shias are crazy. Like, I think the biggest thing around that is like our highly educated scholars who like give us our modern day law rulings have said like causing self bodily harm is not allowed. And then I think even the most important thing is like if what you're doing is causing people to go away from the teachings of Prophet Muhammad and Ahlul Bayt, his family, like it's not allowed, right? And so and plus like that's just a minority that does it, and it's all cultural. Like these different forms of mourning are all cultural at the end of the day. There's nothing in Shia law that tells you you have to do it. Um, the remembrance is something that we do just because that's something we have to do. Like we have to remember mom. That's just nature, right? But how you mourn, there's no right or wrong way to do it, I guess, as long as you're within the bounds. But that in itself isn't like if you don't do it, you're not Shia. Like, it's up
Yeah.
to you, right?
So that's interesting because I know that we wanted to close this off talking about what are the main differences that people pry on, to really separate the sects and say, oh, one is right versus one is wrong. But I feel like after this conversation, I don't think there's anything I'd be like, oh, that's wrong. Like, I don't understand why you do that.
Yeah.
There's definitely more similarities than like, I don't want to negate that there are differences. I know there are, but at the end of the day, what we believe in at our very core is so true and consistent across all the different sects that it's really hard to comprehend why things like Shia genocide in Pakistan or even Bangladesh and like parts of Africa are happening. But
Yeah.
I guess it's important to talk about it. Like one of the questions that we as a group came up with was, well, how can we address this? I think just like having these conversations, like asking uncomfortable questions is probably the easiest step.
Yeah, and like
Hardest.
a lot of friends like from Penn State reached out, right? Like, what can we do to help the Shia community in it? And really, the only thing I can think of is like, don't be afraid to talk about it. And if you hear in your circles things being said, like, try to correct them and educate them. Because really, that's all you can do. Before I kind of talk about like the main differences, I guess, that people are prying on and how we can unite. One thing I did want to mention about the shrines is like sometimes one of the misconceptions that people might see or think of is like when we touch the shrine or we kiss the shrine, right? It's kind of similar to how like we kiss like a toddler that we're in love with, right? Or like how some people will rub their cloth on the shrine and then keep it for their own like safekeeping, whatever, to get blessings out of it. Like, for example, the parable that we relate to is like the story of Prophet Yusuf, how he gave his shirt to his father to restore his blindness. And like, even then, the other misconception I think that we had is like listed as like, why do Shias cry so much? Why do they mourn so much, right? Like, when you feel sorrow and when you hear the tragedies, like, you're gonna cry. Like, there's no other way around it, right? So if you remember it, you're gonna cry. And then like if people say you cry too much, like, again, like Prophet Yusuf's father knew he was alive, and he cried so much that he lost his eyesight, right? He went blind, and then Prophet Yusuf kind of gave him a shirt to restore that blindness. So like those are the two misconceptions also that I hear, and so just to quickly address those, I figured I'd say that. But yeah, the main difference is people pry on, honestly, like Shias, what I've been taught from like the highest scholars who like, they're called Ayatullahs. Like, for example, I follow Ayatollah Sistani, so his rulings is what I follow when it comes to law and ethics and stuff like that. He literally has said like, Sunnis are not your brothers or sisters, like they are your souls. Like, that's how he explains it, which is like pretty deep when you think about it. Like, we're taught to respect our Sunni brothers, sisters, faith to that level where like you're our souls, right? And I think the whole purpose behind that is to create that sense of unity within our communities. And I think what disunites us is when people shy or people go away from what the scholars are preaching, essentially. So like, I think one of the biggest things is when, because we have discrepancies historically, again, it's sensitive. And so we don't see eye to eye on the companions, on all the companions and all the prophets' wives, things of that nature. Because of the events that took place after the prophet's death, which is sensitive, but like there shouldn't be any animosity between each other because of it, you know. And something that our scholars say is like, it's not allowed for you to openly or like to cause disunity by denouncing or cursing or whatever the individuals that our Sunni brothers and sisters really revere, you know. Like, it's not allowed. Like, you shouldn't do it, because at the end of the day, what happens is like, I think that's the biggest thing that these Sunni extremists, or not Sunni extremists, but extremists take advantage of, is like they'll show people clips of these Shia like crazy people who are openly cursing individuals that like our Sunni brothers and sisters really revere, you know? Like, if someone like started cursing out like Imam Ali, God forbid, or like one of their moms, how do you think we'd react? You know, for So in the same sense, like our scholars have openly, like I was watching a video the other day denouncing the Shias who do this, because like he was saying like they get money and their purpose is to disunite each one of us, right? So I think we have to be very vigilant and not generalize both Shia and Sunni when we hear things that we don't agree with, right? And know what the majority thinks and what the majority, how the majority should act at the end of the day. I don't know, Laiba, if you have anything to add, but like our scholars have denounced it. Like they've emphasized unity and focusing on the Quran, the Prophet, and his family, because that's one thing that we all agree on. And at the end of the day, the essence of belief is with the Quran and the Prophet, like Shahada that we recite, right? Like Sahaba, this and that shouldn't be the cause of disunity, because believing in them isn't a part of actual faith. Like it doesn't bring you in Islam and it doesn't bring you out of Islam, right? What does is your belief in the Quran and your belief in the Prophet. So when we hear people saying like Shia kafir, Shias are disbelievers, I think they might be associating that with how we view some of the companions, which historically is like, I mean, if everyone reads what happened historically, like they'll understand why we have some certain feelings, I guess, but it should never be to the point where it takes us out of our unity in essence, right? It's just how we feel towards different people. I don't know, Laiba, if you have anything else to add. Did that make sense? I feel like I was rambling.
It makes sense, makes total sense. And I definitely agree with the point about, telling Sunni friends to come and ask questions. With my friends, I've always told them, like, ask me anything. I'm never going to get offended. Like, I know I'm always going to be happy that at least you came to me rather than holding on to like a misconception or trying to answer it yourself or answering it with like the wrong answer, I guess. Yeah, I guess sometimes people are too afraid to say I disagree. There's like so many conversations I've had with my Sunni friends, and then I'll explain, my beliefs, they'll explain their beliefs, and at the end we'll say, okay, I still believe what I believe. And they'll say, yeah, I still believe what I believe. And it just ends there. And it's not like it causes any tension between us. There's just this understanding of we both have our beliefs and they're both right to us because of our different circumstances, our different, ways of thinking. And it's totally fine to have those.
Yeah, and like one of the major lecturers this year actually spoke on like sectarianism essentially, and he was like, we both sects have their own narrative of history, right? And like all we can do is discuss it. We can never force our narrative on someone else, right? And we have to, at the end of the day, respect each other's narratives, no matter how different they may be, because obviously there's a lot of sensitive issues that come up if you look at life after the Prophet's death that are very sensitive. And like if we discuss it, it might seem sectarian, but it's just our narrative, right? Like how we see the history. And we have to, I think, not be so sensitive with it and be willing to discuss it in a manner, like I said, in Al-Munajat, like the way those two scholars discuss their arguments, like in such a peaceful and kind way. Like anger will never get us anywhere. It's more so just understanding each other's narratives and perspectives. If you agree, great. If you don't, it's okay. Like to each his own at the end of the day. But yeah.
I think it's really important. Laiba and Zen, you both talked about this, is just listening to understand instead of what most people do, which is listening to challenge or argue even. And I don't want to say argue because maybe not everyone enters a conversation with the intention like, oh, I am going to prove them wrong, even though we know a majority of people do. But a lot of people are like, okay, great, you believe this, but I want to challenge you and I want to play devil's advocate. But I feel like even that, for things that are so sensitive, that should not be your primary intention coming into these conversations. You should really just listen to understand and just learn things that you probably didn't know before. And you don't have to leave that conversation feeling differently about your own faith. You can still continue to believe what you believe. Just respect people.
Yeah, like honestly, like when you mentioned that, it reminds me like, because when I got to Penn State, that was my first real exposure to Sunni beliefs and like interacting with people who or Sunni, because like I just grew up in a Shia household, in a Shia community. And so I really forced myself to learn a lot about not only my beliefs historically, but also like what Sunnis believe, right? Why are there differences? What are the differences? And it's very easy to fall into the trap of like who's right, who's wrong, and like I'm learning to disprove versus I'm learning just to understand, right? And then I think your mindset and your intention when you are learning will affect how you interact with those that don't hold the same opinions as you. Like now, thank God, like I'm just like understanding, right? Like I understand your perspective, your narrative. I respect it. Like I hope others have the same feeling towards our narrative. But if we don't talk about these things, then we're gonna let those crazy people chanting Shia Kafir in Pakistan win, right? At the end of the day. And by the way, that doesn't really offend us because like we know our beliefs. So it just makes me laugh, to be honest. At the end of the day, it's kind of sad. But I guess to your question of like how we can unite, this question comes up often, and like for me, it's very simple. Did the Prophet say anything that we can kind of hold on to, both Shia Sunni, that is in both of our books? And there is, like, the Prophet has literally said in his last khutbah, he said, I leave behind two weighty things. Like, as long as you hold on to both of these things, you will never go astray. And if you do, then you will go astray, essentially. And that is the Quran and my Ahlul Bayt, my Ahlul Bayt, my Ahlul Bayt. Ahlul Bayt just means his family. So if we all just gather around like that last message of the Prophet, like I leave behind two weighty things. What are those two that we can unite around? And we both agree in the Prophet's family, and we both agree in the Quran, right? And it's that simple to me. Like, if we disagree on Sahaba and other things, that's okay. Like, we can disagree. The Prophet didn't say I leave behind two things, like the Quran and the Sahaba. Like he said, I leave behind two things, the Quran and my Ahlul Bayt. And if you stick to these, you will stay guided, right? So usually, like whenever, like for example, people yell in Shia Kafir, I'm assuming they haven't stuck to the Ahlul Bayt, because some of them are probably Hafiz al-Quran, right? Like for example, the people who killed Imam Hussein, they were Hafiz al-Quran. Like they literally prayed Maghrib prayers in Jamaat after killing the grandson of the Prophet. You know, like that's how ignorant and arrogant they were. And so it's very easy for us to fall into that trap of arrogance and ignorance, where we think we're Muslim when we're doing something like killing the grandson of the Prophet, right? Because, for example,
killing in general.
Yeah, killing in general, yeah. Like they had the Quran, like they were Hafiz al-Quran, but on the spears they put the Ahlul Bayt, you know. So like if you lose one or the other, you will go astray at the end of the day. And I think within Shia households, even like we need to focus more on, not focus more on, but like as much love as we give to Ahlul Bayt, and obviously scholars and all people do. I'm speaking on my behalf personally. Like I should be more learned in the Quran too. Otherwise, I'm gonna go astray. Like, yeah, I love the Prophet's family, but if I don't love the Quran in the same sense and like try to learn more about the Quran and what it's teaching, then I'm gonna go astray as well. You know, so. Like if we hold on to that last message of the Prophet, I think we can all come together and unite.
That's a really fair point. No, I agree. I think growing up, like I mentioned, like I've never heard about Battle of Karbala, and honestly, I pretty much what Liba said after the Prophet, like after he passed away, I feel like that's the end of the timeline on Islam for me. Like we've just never discussed those things in our household, or even when I had Islamic tutors come and teach me, like those are not stories that we talked about. And largely, I don't want to say they were ill-intentioned. It's largely because my Islamic tutor would come and teach me stories straight from the Quran, and just timeline-wise, they never came up.
Yeah.
But I am not gonna negate that there was a sense of animosity towards some of those events. And I think, like we said, just having those conversations. I do want to say one thing. Zen, you mentioned a couple of scholars from the Shia sect that you follow, and Libe, I would love to hear if you have certain ones. From the Sunni side, and I know Zen and I talked about this before, but Suhaib Webb and Imam Khalid Latif. Both, I follow them, and if you really want to understand more, or if you guys have questions, I would say definitely look them up, see what they're saying. They probably have the best message for kids like us. It's the most relatable, easy to understand. But if you guys have other scholars that you also recommend, please let these people know.
No, like like I think the NYU Muslim chaplaincy like does a great job with Suhaib Webb, Khalid Latif, and then Sheikh Faiyaz Jaffer, who's also a Shia representative of those three. And like, for example, on Muslim Vibe, Suhaib Webb posted a video about Imam Hussein and Karbala, which I think is super helpful for like the Sunni community to like actually learn about this and show them that it's not just a Shia thing, which is what he was saying. And for us as Shia to know, like, it's not just a Shia thing as well. For me, like, there's a bunch of scholars, like for example, Sheikh Faiyaz Jaffer of NYU. Yeah. He does a great job.
Yeah, he has a weekly Shaking It Up with Sheikh Faiyaz. I love that name so much. Also, these are open to everyone. You just have to register on Zoom. It's not just for NYU students. I think that's another barrier. Yeah. People think it's not open, but it is. So you can sign up for them. But yeah, go ahead.
Personally, I would also recommend Sayyid Mustafa Qazwini. I'm a bit biased because I like met him last year and like was like totally like fangirling over him. But he has some great stuff about like Shia-Sunni unity, and his overall message is just that we are the same and we don't need to, stress too much over our differences when we have so much in common.
Yeah, and I think his son, he's the older one, right? Like the Qazwini family is like a whole family of scholars.
There's like so many of them.
His son actually have spoken. I think, Ieasha, you're a part of that Zoom meeting for May initiative with his son, Mehdi Qazwini.
Yeah, I remember. I tried to find him on social media and I didn't.
On Twitter, I'll send you his Twitter. He's really good.
Okay. Sounds good. I need to get a Twitter.
Yeah, there's a lot. So like, I don't know. I could send some maybe after, but
I think wherever we decide to share this video, we could just link the resources in the caption. Just reemphasize that this was not a scholarly discussion.
Scholars.
But thank you guys so much for your time. We have 2 minutes left. I feel like I learned a lot. And even though these are questions that I probably should have asked before, these are questions I've never asked. And thank you for taking time and being open to answering these, because these might seem redundant, or some people might be like, oh, do your own research, but I appreciate you guys volunteering.
I'm always open to having these discussions, and the fact that you reached out, big applaud to you, for setting this whole thing up. Because it's not a lot of people who reach out and do this, and so
this was helpful for whoever's listening.
Yeah, I think it will be, honestly, for both Shia and Sunni. I think it's great to have these kinds of discussions. And this is just the start, hopefully,
Yeah, fingers crossed. Well, thank you, Zen. Thank you, Laiba.
Thank you.
All right. Have a great rest of your night, guys.
Night.
Bye.